In this slightly longer final video, we're going to look at the repetition, the structure of a workout, and how it all works together as a plan. The repetition determines the load and effort that goes into a set. By simply looking at the number of reps on average in sets per workout, you can kind of determine the sport or goal of that workout. The rep not only determines the load, but can also determine the time under tension that the muscle is experiencing during a set. Most of you probably know the classic charts on how many reps equals strength, how many equals size, how many equal power, and all that stuff. But keep in mind, this might not be accurate. There are many different ways to execute an exercise. There are many different people that execute these things, different structures of their body, different fiber types. All these things matter in determining how to choose the optimal rep range. Of course, there are certain things like a snatch that requires a great deal of coordination. You don't often want to do for very high reps if you're really trying to get better at the snatch, because you're losing coordination as the set continues. Also, simply looking at a set of 5 in the bench press, how was that 5 executed? Was it bounced off the chest as fast as possible? Was it controlled for 5 seconds on the way down and 5 seconds on the way up? So it's not quite as simple as looking at the reps, but it gives us a very good idea of what goals this person is trying to accomplish. And using that, it should also guide you in, when creating a program, how to determine the optimal rep range for that person. In my experience, it isn't as simple as lower reps equals strength, higher reps equal muscle size. Especially drug-free athletes need a combination of both. And depending on the person, you lean one way or lean the other. As I mentioned in a previous video, you have to think of the psychology of your athlete or client. Do they even enjoy higher reps, or do they even enjoy lower reps? What is the end goal? How often are they training? Use the charts and the percentage guidelines as just that, just a general guideline. And of course, you don't want to train heavy for too long. You don't want to train with only high reps for too long, no matter what the goal. You must change things up. When training someone for physique purposes, their strength is irrelevant. If they look fantastic and they can't even lift 5 pounds off the ground, you've accomplished your goal. When training an athlete, the way they look is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if someone has a doughy physique. If they win their event, they've won their event. Most people, though, want a combination of both. They don't simply want to have a great physique that's not functional, and they don't want to be very athletic that doesn't look very good. So the average person is kind of training like a combination of a bodybuilder and an athlete. They aren't bodybuilders or athletes, but they want to be better at everyday tasks and look good and feel good, and that's it. They don't care if their biceps are 20 inches or if they can bench press 500 pounds. They just want to look good and get on with their everyday lives. That's an important consideration. A lot of times trainers are bodybuilders or they are athletes, but your clients aren't. So don't confuse your goals with your clients. We've already covered the basics of how to structure a workout in parts 1 through 3. And if you haven't seen those, I highly recommend you check those out, or this won't make too much sense. So now we're going to look at some examples of workouts and how you would structure them. Keep in mind, these are incredibly basic examples, and there are a lot of ways to do this. So don't think this is just one way. But this gives you an idea, based on the things we've talked about before, on how workouts are structured for certain goals.
Bodybuilding as a sport is the development of the physique under a judging criteria. For most people, though, bodybuilding is simply what they do when they go to work out to look better. For the purposes of physique development, hypertrophy, whatever you want to call it, you divide your workouts by body parts. And as discussed earlier, we work from compound to isolation movements. Powerlifting and Olympic weightlifting are sports that are determined by the most weight lifted in very specific lifts. Workouts are structured from the focusing on the competitive lift down to accessory or special exercises. Again, we're still working big to small, the most important thing first. In athletics, different sports, or sometimes even general strength training, we're working from Olympic or plyometric activity, things that involved jumping or speed, down to compound exercises, then down to accessory or special exercises. Again, very similar to above, except we've added the element of speed into the lifts. Therefore, speed needs to be concentrated on first. So if we are looking at a very basic bodybuilding workout, we can see that we start with big bilateral exercises. We work down to unilateral, then down to isolation exercises. And this logically makes the most sense, as we want to work the most muscle with the heaviest lifts first. Now in bodybuilding, there are, of course, exceptions. As someone advances, it takes more to trigger growth in a muscle. And the point is to apply a lot of work and to, for lack of a better term, exhaust the muscle to initiate a growth response. Therefore, you may see workouts such as this, where we have first some injury prevention, the big basic movement with reps, as we discussed reps earlier, being a little bit higher, and then supersets involving the same muscle group. So dumbbell fly right to a dumbbell bench press with the elbows neutral. This puts a lot of stress on the muscle and exhausts it. We aren't going for big lifts. We're trying to do a lot of work. Or something like this, where we have longer eccentric action, thereby increasing, as we discussed, the time under tension of the set. So instead of the time it takes to simply do 8 reps at standard pace, by controlling the eccentric, we're increasing the time that the muscle's under tension. And in one final example, we have this workout where the pull downs are performed with a rest pause at the end of each set, which means you rest for a few seconds, then try to get some more reps. And also a standard barbell deadlift at the end of the workout instead of the beginning. Again, the goal here isn't to move as much weight as possible, but use the deadlift as an exercise to simply cause muscular growth rather than strength increase. For powerlifting and weightlifting, or really any strength sport, the goal is to get stronger in the competitive lift or event. So again, the focus is the competitive lift and then the accessory or special exercises. It's easy to get carried away with creating workouts. And this is an important note, especially for athletes. There are thousands and thousands of options. But again, workouts don't have to be very complicated, and they don't have to have a lot of volume. And if you want to be the best at something, such as if you want to have the best clean and jerk of all time, you don't need to waste energy on something like a lot of specific training for your biceps and calves. It's a waste of energy and time. Looking at a powerlifting workout, in this random example, you'll see it very much at this stage in this very long program resembles a bodybuilding workout in terms of working from big to small. The difference is the emphasis is on the competitive lift and the reps are much lower. Here in this example, this person's workout is controlled by percents. In this same example, going further towards competition, you can see there's even less exercises per workout. Again, more time being spent on the competitive lift, and on this day, fortunately or unfortunately for them, a lot of single attempts at near maximal weights. And then specific lifts for their weakness, with low bar good morning and glute ham raise as 2 primary or accessory exercises. I would say that their weakness is low back and hamstrings in the squat. In this example for Olympic lifting, there's even fewer exercises. I would guess in a workout like this, there might be some additional stretching or abs and stuff, but these are the most important things. This day looks like the emphasis is on moderate weights in the power snatch and light weights in the clean and jerk. So this day they're focusing more on their snatch, as we can see by the accessory lift. On another day, we can see they have back squats first, making me think that this person's focus is increasing their leg strength, as oftentimes back squat would be after the competitive lifts. As oftentimes back squat would be after some of the competitive lifts, as the emphasis is more on the actual clean and snatch. Finally, we're going to look at athletics or sports training, at least for explosive sports where weight training is important. You might be realizing that if you're training an average Joe or Jane, the method you use might be a combination of these things, and that is perfectly legitimate and in fact what you should do. A lot of time is spent separating these things and specializing when people don't need to be specialists. We can see in this example that it looks like a lot of work for this athlete, but there are a number of supersets. So this workout is designed to be performed, again, with the most important lifts first. I'd say these first 4. And then these, the workout pace would increase. And we can also see this by the sets. More sets are dedicated to the important lifts. This combines the explosiveness of the Olympic lifts with general strength training and the hypertrophy work from the accessory exercises. We can see this as well on this day that focuses more on the lower body, but not exclusively. And this is important, is that it doesn't have to be separated by body parts because this person is not a bodybuilder. You don't want to be so sore you can't walk the next day. You need to be able to train for your event. Therefore, you don't want to completely exhaust the muscles. You want to train them and get a response, but not exhaust them.
You'll notice that some of the examples we just looked at in Moji were very long-term plans. I mentioned how it's hard to determine how effective a program is or how good a program is just by looking at a single day or a single week when it's part of a very long and broad spectrum. Keep in mind that when you have a beginning athlete or a beginning client, you don't need very long programs because their bodies are changing very fast. It would be hard to know how they're going to adapt to the workouts you're giving them without seeing them week to week and adjusting every week or every few weeks based on their capabilities. It's important to remember that the body's always trying to adapt to the stress that you impose on it. That's why workouts have to change eventually, so the stress on the body changes and it has to adapt again. By adapt, the body has to get bigger muscles and or get stronger, so the stress isn't so much that you give it. So if you're training with 100 pounds for 10 reps over and over, eventually the body has no reason to change. And of course, at first, bodies will change quite a bit. But as you progress, that change is harder and harder to make a change as humans have limits to strength and size that they can obtain. The more advanced someone is, the more often a workout has to change. This doesn't mean you have to change it every day, but it might need a more consistent progression instead of doing 3 sets of 10 for 10 weeks in a row and expecting results to happen. Of course, on top of that, everyone's an individual. I usually recommend changing workouts somewhere between every 4 to 6 weeks, if for nothing else, simply for boredom. Some people are good with just doing the same thing over and over, but at about 4 or 6 weeks, I find most people are bored, and that's when most people are starting to see less results. Remember, a change doesn't have to be much. It can simply be changing the amount of reps, and as we talked about before, the reps determine the amount of load that they're putting on their bodies. So if they're doing sets of 12 and you switch that to sets of 6, they're lifting much heavier, and the body will feel and adapt to that new stress, which is what we want it to do. You can also be creative with, if you have limited options on on equipment someone may use, adding bands to a bar, adding chains to a bar, changing the speed of their reps, changing the rest between sets, changing how often they work out. All of these things matter, and all of these things count as a change. So remember, don't get too caught up in you only have a barbell and a power rack to work with. That's more than enough. You can do hundreds, if not thousands, of exercises with very simple pieces of equipment like that. You just have to think a little bit. Like any plan, you should have a long-term outline and a more detailed plan for the short term. it's not really possible to plan an Olympic athlete for 4 years. You could have a very general outline for 4 years through the next Olympic cycle, but you're not going to know what happens on year 2 when their ACL busts or something like that. Then you'd have to rewrite everything. So you should know in very general terms where the progression should be, how they need to get better. And then for the short term, which I would say would be 4 months or less, have a very specific idea of the rest they're going to get, the exercises they're going to perform, the reps, what the goal is, all of that kind of stuff. Outside of about 3 or 4 months, it's very difficult to plan for anyone. Most of my workouts end at about that range, or if I have anything longer, they are very adaptable, which brings us to our final point. Be ready to adapt. Some people like to make these beautiful plans, but they fail to adapt when something changes for the athlete. If they have a very squat-focused program and the athlete's knees start getting sore, instead of pulling back the squats, they start doing everything possible to keep them squatting, which is fine, but why not reduce the squat load? If their knees are consistently getting worse, you can just stop squatting altogether. And if that sounds like sacrilege, well, then you're not being that creative, are you? You can always come back to it and try again. And that happens with my athletes all the time. If someone gets hurt in the middle of this beautiful program, it has to stop. And then months later, they can try again. But don't fall in love with a program without being ready to adapt. And also, perhaps even more importantly, don't fall in love with ineffective programs. You can spend a lot of time creating these beautiful masterpieces of exercise, but if they're not effective, it's pointless. It doesn't matter how much time you spent with it, or it doesn't matter how much thought or science you think went into it. It works or it doesn't. Or maybe it only works for a specific population. Again, be ready to adapt and be ready to edit yourself and throw out your ideas. In any realm of creativity, the hardest thing to do is edit yourself. I hope you've learned something during this series and it wasn't too boring. Maybe it was too basic for you, and for a lot of trainers it should be. But I believe in always reviewing the basics. A simple fact, like mentioned in the first video, working big to small, that's something that people forget. Or that you don't have to fall in love with the charts. You can adapt to them. You can change for the athlete. If you've learned a lot from this, I hope this is just the beginning of your journey. I'd highly recommend reading some books on it. Not the internet, books. To this day, I get more out of books than the internet. People get things from books and write that on the internet. That isn't to say the internet doesn't have wonderful information and isn't an incredible resource. But don't forget to get back to the basics. Read some textbooks, then read your favorite author on the internet. Find out where they're getting their information. Because you shouldn't be copying anyone. You should be creating your own realm and your own way of training. Program design is a complicated topic, and it will get more complicated with time because we don't know the perfect programs. Science is very limited. Remember that. We are just trying our best based on the science and evidence that we have. This isn't a perfect science. So in a way, once you know the science, you can find your own way. Know and learn the science first. Hopefully this taught you something, and hopefully you'll come away as a better trainer.